This is chapter 21, part 11. We're going to look at the arteries in the systemic circulation. So the systemic circulation carries oxygen and nutrients to body tissues and also removes carbon dioxide and other wastes as well as heat from tissues. All systemic arteries are going to branch from the aorta. So right here. And then deoxygenated blood is going to return deoxygenated blood is going to return to the heart from systemic veins. Now the aorta, this is the largest artery of the body, and it has a diameter about 2 to 3 centimeters. It has 4 principal regions of the aorta. The first one is the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, the thoracic aorta, which is going to be right here, and then also the abdominal aorta. So the thoracic aorta is going to be above the diaphragm. So diaphragm's right here, so it's kind of right here, kind of behind the heart. And then the abdominal aorta is down here. With the ascending and arch of the aorta, they're kind of hard to see with this small picture, but you have the ascending aorta right here coming out of the heart, and then it arches over right here as the arch of the aorta. Now each division of the aorta, each of these 4, gives off arteries that branch into these distributing arteries that lead to various organs. And then within the organs, the arteries are going to divide into arterioles and then into capillaries that are going to service these systemic tissues. Systemic tissues are really all tissues except for the alveoli in the lungs. All tissues but alveoli. So everything but those alveoli in the lungs. So here we can actually have a little bit of a closer and more detailed view of these, the aorta, portions of the aorta, as well as a little bit of these systemic arteries. So here we have the portion of the aorta that comes out of the left ventricle, posterior to the pulmonary trunk, is the ascending aorta. And here you can see it a little better on this diagram here. It's going to be right here. This part of the aorta is going to be the ascending aorta. And the ascending aorta actually gives off 2 coronary arteries that supply the myocardium of the heart. Those 2 coronary arteries that supply the myocardium are not, they're not present here on this diagram, but know that they come off of the ascending aorta. Then the ascending aorta arches to the left, and this forms the arch of the aorta. So this is going to be right here. And it descends at the level of the intervertebral discs between the 4th and 5th vertebrae. So here we have kind of this schematic of the branches coming from the ascending aorta. And first off, the ascending aorta is only about 2 inches in length, and it begins at the aortic valve. Then we have the right and left coronary arteries that are coming off of the ascending aorta, and they come off just superior to the aortic valve. And remember, they form that kind of a crown-like ring around the heart that branches off to the atrial and ventricular myocardium. Then we have these branches of each of these coronary arteries. So first off, we have, remember, the posterior interventricular branch, which is going to supply blood to both ventricles. Then the marginal branch is going to be the other branch from the right coronary artery, and this supplies blood to the right ventricle. Then from the left coronary artery, we're going to have the anterior interventricular branch. And this is going to supply both ventricles as well. And then from the left coronary artery, we also get the circumflex branch, which is going to supply the left atrium and the left ventricle. Oh, I forgot to mention too, the right coronary artery also supplies blood to the right atria as well, or right atrium. Now, the arch of the aorta, which is down here in this diagram, this is almost 2 inches in length as well, and it's just a continuation of the ascending aorta. It's going to be directed superiorly and posteriorly to the left and then goes inferior. And it ends at the intervertebral disc between the 4th and 5th thoracic vertebrae, and this is where it becomes the thoracic aorta. Now there are 3 major arteries that branch from the superior aspect of the arch of the aorta. These are the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian. Now the first and largest branch from the arch of the aorta is the brachiocephalic trunk. So that's going to be right here. You can see that first branch from the arch. Now it extends superiorly and it kind of bends slightly to the right, and it divides at the sternoclavicular joint to form the right subclavian artery, which is right here, and also the right common carotid artery, which is this one. Now the second branch from the arch of the aorta, this one right here, is the left common carotid artery. Now we also have the right common carotid artery coming off of that brachiocephalic trunk, but they do both kind of go up and they have the same branches and names as each other. So on the right here we have the right common carotid artery, which is branching off of the brachiocephalic trunk, and all the branches that come off of that as well. For both branches, we're going to have a internal carotid and an external carotid. So here we have the right internal and external carotid branches, whereas on the left common carotid artery, we would just have the left internal and the left external carotid arteries. Now these are actually going to come up together. You can see here they're coming closer together, and they're actually going to branch together to form the basilar artery and this area at the bottom of the brain, inferior side of the brain, called the circle of Willis right here. So on the left here is part of that schematic that we saw before with the different trunks coming out of the arch of the aorta. And here you can see the right internal carotid artery branches off into the anterior cerebral, or the right anterior cerebral artery, and the right middle cerebral artery. And the same thing kind of happens with that left internal carotid artery that will branch off into the left anterior cerebral artery and left middle cerebral artery. Now the anterior cerebral artery, you can see kind of on the right here, we're going to see these two anterior cerebral arteries, one on each side, and these are going to pass forward toward the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. And then also we have the middle artery, or the middle cerebral artery here, that's going to pass laterally between the temporal and parietal lobes of the cerebrum. So these are supplying blood to the brain. Now, this base of the brain picture on the right, we can see those left and right internal carotid arteries, which are right here. These two big arteries here. And you also have these basilar arteries here, this one, which are kind of forming these anastomoses around the brain, providing these alternate routes of blood flow to the brain. And it's really important to have anastomoses in the brain, because if you do have something occur where there's a blockage in one of the arteries, you could lose function to a complete area of the brain without these anastomoses. Now, these, along with the anterior communicating, the posterior, and the posterior cerebral, these all form this arrangement of blood vessels at the base of the brain, which is called the circle of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle. Okay, moving on to the thoracic aorta. So it's about 8 inches long, so it's kind of longer than the other two portions of the aorta that we've talked about so far, and it's really just a continuation of the arch of the aorta. It begins at the intervertebral disc between the 4th and 5th thoracic vertebrae, where it lies to the left of the vertebral column, which is right here. Now, as the thoracic aorta descends, it moves closer to the midline, and it extends through an opening in the diaphragm, right here, which is called the aortic hiatus. The aortic hiatus. And so this opening in the diaphragm is located anterior to the vertebral column between the 12th thoracic vertebrae and the 1st lumbar vertebrae. So right there in the diaphragm where the aorta goes through. Now, the thoracic aorta has two main branches, the visceral and parietal branches, that are going to branch off further into structures throughout the thorax. And now, as you can kind of see here, the two major branches of the thoracic aorta, the visceral branches and the parietal branches, are going to go to different areas of the thorax. The visceral branches are going to go to organs in the thorax. These are like the pericardials, which are down here. The bronchioles, going to the lungs, are up here. We also have the esophageals, going to the esophagus, and those are going to be about here, and the mediastinals, which are right here. So those are going to be going to the organs within the thorax, whereas the other branch of the thoracic aorta, the parietal branches, these are going to go more so to the walls of the thorax. So these would be ones like the posterior intercostals. So here we have the right posterior intercostal, which is right here, and we would see the same on the left side as well. Also the subcostals, which I don't believe is labeled on this diagram, but then also the superior phrenic. So here we have the left superior phrenic, and we're going to see the same on the right side right here. So those are going to be more towards the walls of the thorax. So here the phrenic is going to be on the diaphragm, and the intercostals are going to be between the ribs there. Okay, now we're moving on to the abdominal aorta, which is just a continuation of the thoracic aorta after it passes through the diaphragm. So it begins at the aortic hiatus in the diaphragm, and it ends about the level of the fourth lumbar vertebrae, and this is where it's going to actually divide into the left and right common iliac arteries. Now, just like the thoracic aorta, the abdominal aorta branches off into visceral and parietal branches. Now, there are three main parietal branches: inferior phrenic, lumbar, and median sacral. And there are actually six major visceral branches: the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric trunk, suprarenal, the renal, gonadal, and inferior mesenteric. So in this diagram, we can actually see the abdominal aorta here. We have this diaphragm and the aortic hiatus right here, where the abdominal aorta is then coming through. The unpaired visceral branches arise from the anterior surface of the aorta, and these include like the celiac trunk, which is right here in the middle, and the superior mesenteric right here, and then also the inferior mesenteric arteries. The inferior mesenteric artery just isn't labeled on this diagram. Now here, the celiac trunk, this is the first visceral branch of the aorta inferior to the diaphragm, and it actually divides into three branches. These three branches of the celiac trunk are the left gastric, the splenic, and the common hepatic arteries. And you can see this on the past diagram as well, where you can see that the celiac trunk has these three divisions. And you can also see these three divisions on this diagram as well. Here we have the left gastric, whoops, different color. Left gastric artery there, the splenic artery is this one, and then the common hepatic artery labeled here, it's going to be this branch here. So these are the three branches off of this main celiac trunk here. Now this trunk supplies all the organs of the gastrointestinal tract that arise from the abdominal part of the esophagus to the duodenum, and then also the spleen, being the splenic artery. Now in this diagram, you can see the superior mesenteric artery, and it arises from the anterior surface of the abdominal aorta, and it extends inferiorly and anteriorly between the layers of the mesentery. Remember, the mesentery is the portion of the peritoneum that attaches the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. Now, as we also saw in that schematic of the abdominal aorta, the superior mesenteric artery branches into 5 different arteries. First off is the inferior pancreaticoduodenal artery. Next is the jejunal. Then we have the ileocolic. The right colic. And also the middle colic. And you can see these branches here as well. First one, the inferior pancreaticoduodenal. Also the jejunals, first one is there. Jejunals are going to be here. The ileocolic is right here. Next we have the right colic, which is then this one, and then also the middle colic, which is this branch up here. Now the superior mesenteric artery supplies all the organs of the gastrointestinal tract that come out of the embryonic midgut. So we're talking about everything from the duodenum to the transverse colon. Now next we have the inferior mesenteric artery, which is this branch right here, and it comes out of the anterior aspect of the abdominal aorta as well, and it comes out at the level of the third lumbar vertebrae and then passes inferiorly to the left of the aorta. You can see here, and it has 3 branches. So these are the left colic artery, sorry about that, left colic artery, the sigmoid arteries, and then also the superior rectal artery. So these are here, the left colic artery branching off there. Next we have the sigmoids, which are these, and then also the superior rectal artery, just going to be this one, going to the rectum. So the inferior mesenteric artery supplies all the organs of the gastrointestinal tract that come from the embryonic hindgut. So this comes from the transverse colon up here and down to the rectum. So here in this picture you can see the celiac trunk and the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries kind of in relation to the rest of the abdomen and the pelvis. You can see these kidneys here, and this kind of paler one is going to be the aorta there. Whereas this other large blood vessel on the left is the inferior vena cava, it's a vein. So here you have, erase this quickly, you have the celiac trunk coming off right here, the superior mesenteric artery right below that, and then the inferior mesenteric artery right there as well. All right, so now here we have a schematic going into the lower body. So here we have the abdominal aorta, and it ends by actually dividing into the right and left common iliac arteries. Then these in turn are going to divide into the right and left internal iliac arteries. And then in the sequence, the external iliacs become the femoral arteries in the thighs, then the popliteal arteries, which are just posterior to the knee, and then the anterior and posterior tibial arteries in the leg. Now this is just showing the right common iliac branching off, but the left common iliac over here is going to be the same. Now these internal iliac arteries carry most of the blood supply to the pelvic viscera as well as the wall of the pelvis. In this diagram, you can also see those branches. So starting here at the right common iliac here, moving into the right internal iliac artery, and then the external iliac artery. And then we're going into the femoral artery down here, and this artery then into the popliteal artery behind the knee here. And then we're going to be kind of branching off a little bit more. So we're going to have the anterior and posterior tibial arteries. You can see those two here. Looking at the anterior and posterior tibials. Then the anterior is going to then branch into the right dorsalis pedis down here, and into the right arcuate, the dorsa metatarsal or dorsal metatarsal, and then the dorsal digital. So that's going to all come from the right anterior tibial. Then the plantar arteries are going to kind of come from a bit of both. The posterior tibial artery and the right dorsalis pedis are going to kind of branch or come together rather, merge, and kind of go to the right lateral plantar, which goes into the right plantar arch, into the right plantar metatarsal, and then into the right plantar digital. And you can see this all from that diagram, that schematic diagram that we looked at a little while ago. And that's going to be the end of Chapter 1, Part 11.